And joining me now is Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Ed, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you. This will be the first virtual General Assembly meeting. And I know, having covered these before, how do you think that will affect the way it's conducted, Ed?
Well, I think it's going to be a very different kind of fall assembly for the U.S. bishops. One of the primary functions of these things is not just to get all the bishops in one place at one time to vote on business and elect committee chairs, but really to bring them together, to be in one room, to have that sort of frank and informal and in some cases private exchanges of ideas that allow them to build the kind of collegiality that they need to act and speak when necessary as a single group. And I think they're really going to lack that this year. I think when we talk about sensitive issues like the McCarrick report and things like that, something else that will be lacking, certainly for Catholics watching the assembly as it happens, is we won't be able to have that sense of a room, which has been so powerful in the last couple of meetings that were in person.
Yeah. As we know, Ed, this meeting follows the release of a long-anticipated Vatican report on former U.S. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. What are your takeaways from that report, and how do you think it'll be handled by the bishops?
Well, I think the report has been pretty hard reading for every Catholic that's tried to get through it, all 450 pages. Some parts of it were, quite shocking in the detail of the abuse committed by Theodore McCarrick. I think more shocking for a lot of Catholics to read was the way in which over a period of years, even decades, allegations about Theodore McCarrick seem to be systematically brushed aside or ignored or not given any real attention to. And I think this is something the U.S. bishops are really going to have to struggle with all over again. I don't think there's a crisis of sexual abuse going on in the church today, but I think there's still very much a crisis of confidence in the episcopacy in the U.S. today. And I think that's something the bishops meeting virtually next week are going to have to grapple with.
Earlier this week, Pope Francis, as you know, offered prayers to McCarrick's victims. In your opinion, what message do you think this report sends to survivors of clergy sex abuse?
Well, I don't think the report itself as a report sends a message to anyone. I think this is one of the things that's been most difficult and confusing for many Catholics as they read it, is it doesn't appear to be a report with its own voice, and it doesn't appear to be a report addressed to anyone in particular. It's a very dry, very detailed, and sometimes very painful to read account of a very unpleasant history, a very unpleasant chapter in the Church of the United States and in the Vatican's history. So I think something that a lot of Catholics are looking for, and Pope Francis has certainly taken a lead on that, is to hear the Church speaking with its own voice, speaking to not just the victims of sexual abuse, although certainly them first and foremost, but to all Catholics who've been scandalized by this, and to look to bridge the gap that has developed between the faithful and their leaders.
Ed, we have about probably a minute left, but I'm curious, what other subjects will you be looking to see addressed by the bishops next week?
Well, there's certainly the usual slate of committee chairs that are up for election. Among them, religious liberty, pro-life activities, doctrine, issues like that. And as Archbishop Corleone, I think it was, said, this is where many of the real decisions are taken in the conference. This is where a lot of the hard day-to-day work gets done. And so I think who is selected for those various committee chairs is always a very interesting indication of where the sense of the U.S. bishops is on different subjects. I think it's often more telling than documents or statements that are put out by the conference. A better way of gauging where the U.S. bishops are, how they're thinking as a group, is often who they elect to speak for them on certain sensitive issues. I think also looking at the sort of domestic political sphere, the renewal of the Bishops' Ad Hoc Committee on Racism, I think, is sure to pass, if not unanimously, certainly overwhelmingly. I think we can predict that with some certitude, and I think that's something which, looking at the situation in the United States over the last year and some of the demonstrations and protests we've had, that's going to be an important part of the bishop's ministry coming forward.
All right, Ed. Well, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Thanks again, Ed.
Always a pleasure.